Cool. Let me find my screen. Okay, yeah. As I said in the pre, so or whatever we call it, it's extremely awkward presenting at the screen into nothingness. I just see my slides, which is horrible. So uh, if I forget anything suddenly or I disappear, just give me a shout and I'll fix it somehow. So yeah, hi, welcome everyone. Actually, let me close the door. There we go. Yeah, the title of this talk is COVID-19 and the dark side of web accessibility. The prompt for this talk was actually that last week James had a talk called COVID-19 and the dark side of web performance, which I enjoyed a whole lot. Before I was really into accessibility, I was really into web performance, or I like to think that I can do more than one thing and still be into web performance. And I really appreciated what James was saying, that, hey, so many of the things we do not serve users on medium devices. Like many people who don't have like this uber expensive, like, computers or smartphones, and especially like in congested network conditions, which we're all in due to COVID-19, it means that maybe our common ways of doing things do not serve people well, even though, we want them because they allow us to make things fast. Yeah, I think myself, I've spent the last few weeks in a mix of feeling very frustrated and tired, I think. More tired, I would say. Because I've seen a lot of things online on the coronavirus, like many applications and websites and everything. Um, and so when I saw James talk about, hey, is this serving everybody well? It was a bit of a relief for me because I said that, hey, somebody else is thinking about these things, which, I mean, somebody else is thinking about these things. We have 600 like amazing people in this company. But what I really mean about that is that when you're in that headspace where you're like, or well, myself at least, feeling very tired and frustrated, it's really easy to lose sight of that. Um, and so I thought, hey, like, let's just literally take the title, swap accessibility for performance, and see where we end up. Um, just to give you some guidance, why are we here? So first of all, there is a global pandemic, right? Like, I think all of our sites are remoting right now. Many countries in the world are like in lockdown and stuff. And I think a very natural thing to think when in the situation is, hey, what can I do? What can we do? I think that's a very natural response. And I think as technologists, our immediate answer to that is like, make an app, make a site, make a thing for it, because that's what we know how to do, right? And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. So I really understand this drive. So with anything I say, keep in mind that I truly understand what it means to want to help in a way. That's why I'm talking to you about accessibility, because that's what I know how to do in a way, or what I think I can contribute. So a little bit about the road ahead. We're going to talk about accessibility during calm times, let's say, not during a global pandemic. We're going to talk about disability. We're going to talk about accessibility under stress. So again, in a coronavirus situation, perhaps. And we're going to talk about building support. Okay, what is the state of accessibility during calm times? Pretty sad for me, if you ask me. These are the results from, this is one graph from the WebAIM Million survey. To give you some context, WebAIM is a company that works a lot on accessibility and especially on doing surveys and research. So they have a lot of surveys about how people use different assistive technologies like screen readers, and they also have this WebAIM Million survey. They look at the top million websites on the Alexa ranking, so like the top million most popular websites. There's more in that link below. And they categorize, they have a lot of findings, but one of the interesting ones that I like is the common web content accessibility guideline failures. The WCAG is the web content accessibility guidelines as a percentage of home pages. And here you can see some of the common issues. So low contrast is on 80% of web pages. Missing alternative text and empty links are over half. Missing form labels are about half. So imagine that again, half of the home pages in the millions are practically inaccessible when it comes to forms because they don't have labels. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. This has been true last year. Actually, this year's results came out a few days ago, and there's a nice comparison in that thing. Spoilers, it hasn't gotten better. But with all of this, I want to clarify that I truly don't believe that half of the sites, or like especially not the sites, because the sites are not entities. Well, though collectively they might be, like the people working on those sites. I don't think that any of them woke up in the morning and said, "I'm gonna make an inaccessible site." As a whole, like how we prioritize things and what our processes like prompt us to do leads to these results. Like we have the numbers. WebAIM also notes that the vast majority of barriers recorded stem from these 6 categories. Addressing just these few concepts will significantly improve accessibility across the web. I agree with that. I think if you ask any sort of accessibility practitioner, they will tell you that these issues are not actually super interesting, in the sense that we know how to do these things for 20 years now. The WCAG has been out for almost 20 years now. Maybe I'm wrong on that number. Let me think about that. I'll let you know afterwards. But still, they're not very involved in a way, which can be a very good thing in the sense that, oh, okay, we need to fix these common things and we will vastly make things more accessible. This is the thing that comes up a lot in accessibility, that a lot of the common issues you can even find automatically, for example. But I don't want to go talking too much about accessibility without first talking a little bit about disability. And especially, I think, seeing how we talk about disability can inform us as to why our processes prioritize or don't prioritize accessibility. So in the 1980s, the WHO, the World Health Organization, would think of disability as a personal attribute. Like it's something inherent to you, and like you are disabled. And if you can't access this site, it's because you are blind or something like that. At the most extreme, of course, I'm editorializing a little bit. Thankfully, modern understanding of disability is a little bit nicer, again, in my opinion, in that it's context dependent. It has to do with mismatch between the person and the environment that they're in. So it's not necessarily that like you can enter this building because you're in a wheelchair. It's because there is not a ramp for you to go up. And again, it's complex, right? And it's not just something like purely like inherent on the person, like something that you have necessarily. It's people can experience barriers in different circumstances. And again, you can have that for all of the senses. Let's take sight real quick on that image. And this is again credits to Microsoft and their Inclusive Design Handbook, which is a very good small book if you want to go through it. So for example, seeing, right? You might be permanently blind, in which case you might be using a screen reader, a piece of assistive technology that reads out the structured markup of the page to help you use the site. You might be temporarily disabled or have be experiencing barriers temporarily. For example, if you have cataracts, it might be the case that in certain conditions you cannot see the page as well, or you might have some screen magnification tool. So there's a sort of spectrum of assistive technologies that you can use. Or it might be situational. You might just be distracted at the moment, and so you're not noticing what exactly fields, which fields you're filling in. Or you might be stressed, actually, which I think when it comes to the coronavirus, stress is a very big thing. I'll give you a quick example in forms and error handling. So this is a form. There's a field, username or email, and there is a text box below it with a placeholder. So if you were to visit this field with a screen reader, it would say, hey, this is a text input, it's a username or email, and by the way, it's empty. You haven't put in any info yet. And same thing with the password, it would say, hey, this is a password, it's a text field, it's not hidden right now because it's a password field, but you've clicked on it and you can see it and you filled in things. If those things were missing and you were using a screen reader, you would hear text input, login, which maybe you could guess, but like depending on the form, probably not. A little bit of a more advanced pattern is error handling. Now, error handling is not in one of those common accessibility issues. It's one of those more involved, research-based ones that, people have put hundreds of hours into figuring out. I like the work that the design service in the UK government has done. They have this error summary component where they would expose the errors both next to the field and in a summary at the top with links to the field. So it covers a really broad range of assistive technologies, of situations that people might be in. They will most likely be able to fill out that form, which is fantastic. So when we think again a little bit more about the modern understanding of disability, we can think, okay, who benefits from accessibility in a way? Of course, it will be people who are blind or who are low vision and use a screen reader. They benefit immensely because it's the difference between not being able to fill in the form, like not knowing what the fields are, and knowing that this is a text field with a username and a password. People with low vision might use like a large screen magnification, so actually having the label next to the input helps a lot. People of varying tech literacy. Again, thinking a little bit about the coronavirus situation, we suddenly have people who are expected to use digital services maybe over the span of a few weeks, and we cannot just assume that they use computers 24/7 and they know what a form error is, or even what a form labeled as a placeholder is. And also people that are stressed, like if somebody is worrying, hey, do I have coronavirus symptoms, or somebody is wondering what's the progress of the coronavirus in Finland, like, oh, we've been in lockdown for 2 weeks, I really want to go into this table and find the statistics, and maybe there's a complex interaction to select your country. It's a lot. It gets to be a lot. So I think a lot about accessibility under stress these days, and I think about accessibility under stress for one more reason. And that's taken from Design for Real Life. It's a book by Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Butzer. I hope I am pronouncing their names correctly. I tried to look online a bit. That you can find on A Book Apart. Essentially, one of the chapters is called Incorporated Stress Cases. As technologists, we tend to talk about quite often about edge cases. So we say, hey, this page under these conditions, if you press this button, it breaks, and that is an edge case. But of course, when somebody is blind and visits your site with a screen reader, or somebody is distracted in a moment and they cannot find the information they need, they're not an edge case. Like, first of all, because they're people, you can't just call them edge cases. But also because those things will happen invariably. Like, there are people that we make assumptions, right, about who's using our service. And in scenarios of crisis, let's say, in scenarios of stress, and I don't just mean people being stressed, but like, ambiently, being a lot of pressure, these assumptions will come to the surface very prominently. Which is also to say that in a stressful situation, even more people than you might think of initially will benefit from accessible sites. I hope I have convinced you in a way, like the way we understand accessibility nowadays and disability is that a very large amount of people will benefit from having an accessible site, especially when there is a stressful situation around. So if you will take one thing away from this whole presentation, is that you can help out by making something accessible, even if it is not novel. So going back to that initial question of how can I help? What can I do, right? What is in my power to do? If you would put your energy into something, I would say putting your energy into making something accessible is incredibly valid and valued at this time. Of course, when we're talking about under stress, in the same way that users are stressed, I would say that we can be much more stressed as well under these situations. Tight deadlines, of course, they can happen even in normal days, not due to coronavirus, that the tight deadline stresses us. The urge to help, again, like I want to help now, and like, we should have this out tomorrow, let's say. And also, I think something that James was referring to last week is that in a pinch, we will rely on our familiar processes. Of course we will. Like, it's what allows us to make things fast. It's what we're used to. It's what we're confident in. Like, I wouldn't expect somebody to go read the book, have something out tomorrow. I get it. And many of our processes are not tuned for accessibility. So much of our thinking is still about edge cases. So much of our thinking is still about, accessibility is for blind people using screen readers, which is like a very narrow definition of it. And also, I think even if you do care about accessibility, I think when there is a mismatch between caring and sort of the priorities that a team or the stakeholders or whatever it is sets, it can be really stressful. Like, this whole thing started by me basically being burned out over 2 weeks just by seeing all of these things out there. So it's a lot, and we can be under stress as well. So I would like to sort of start wrapping up by talking a little bit about building support, and definitely not definitive. In fact, we have plenty of time after this to discuss other ways of building support that I'm probably not thinking about. So first of all, if you already work in accessibility, know that you're already helping. Like, really, you don't need to do everything, and that's something I need to remind myself as well sometimes. Just being around to offer your insight helps a lot. And there's other people out there that also care about this. So we have an accessibility channel. If you haven't joined yet, do so. It's fun, I promise. If it's not fun, let me know. I hope it's fun. And you can even talk to people privately if you're more comfortable with that. That's also perfectly valid. And also remind yourself to take breaks. And I need to remind myself to take breaks. This week, I have just stopped clicking on COVID-19 application links because I know that as soon as I click on that, I'm going to start thinking about all the ways it might be inaccessible. By the way, it might be perfectly accessible. I'm not saying that everything out there is horrible, but like my mind is entirely in that mode of like finding, issues. And so I've just stopped clicking. It's like I can be kind to myself for a week and decide what I'm going to do the next week with mild success. Now, if you want to start, if you're watching this presentation, you're saying, hey, like this seems interesting and I have energy to spare, I have time to spare. First of all, great, thank you. If you're prompted to work in accessibility, I have two main things for you. Lighthouse is a browser plugin that, it's a plugin that runs in a browser. So it's literally something you can run on every site. James also presented about it last week. It has automated checks for accessibility. You can only catch maybe 30% of the issues automatically, but that 30% tends to be missing labels, low contrasts. So it's a lot of those very common and important things. So while not comprehensive, it can help a lot. Accessibility Insights is another tool. It's by Microsoft. Lighthouse is by Google. And Accessibility Insights has a manual or a guided mode. So what Accessibility Insights does is it will give you a very long list of like 30 things, some of which can be checked automatically, many of which you would have to check yourself. It would probably take you half an hour to go through a single page with that, but I think it's definitely worth it. It's definitely worth it because you will catch a lot of issues, even if you didn't know about them before. And the other thing that it does is that it helps you build intuition. So once you go through a few sites and you find what issues there are, you start to build a mental model of what it is to quickly check a site. And this intuition is really helpful because, as we said earlier, under stress, these shortcuts help us a lot, help us to conserve energy, help us to be efficient, and so on. I think that would be a really cool thing to try out. And if you do, let us know in the accessibility flow how it went. And finally, you might be watching this and say, hey, I don't have the time or the energy or the role or the mandate, and that's fine. Like, I'm not saying that everybody on accessibility now, with all of these coronavirus applications, there's people who are really interested in security and privacy and scaling things to millions of people, translating things to languages that are not English. All of these are extremely valuable. And if you're doing any of these, you're already helping. Don't worry about it. If you would like to do one thing, consider asking the stakeholders in sort of the application or whatever it is you're building about accessibility as a way to sort of normalize the conversation about it. Say, hey, like we really care about this scaling thing. What's our plan for accessibility? That's also going to be important. And also talk to your colleagues. You might have things in common. Like that's one of the things I realized when James was talking last week, that, oh yeah, like there's people who care a lot about performance right now being stressed about this situation. And yeah, sure, we're concerned about different things, but ultimately the stress is the same. And turns out that sharing that also was a relief for me. Yeah, I don't know. Let's talk. That's the way I'm going to wrap this up because I don't have any good summary otherwise. I have some references in the full slides, and the link to the full slides is on that link over there, and I'll post it on Slack as well. Thank you.
Thank you for this. Does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts, ideas? Feel free to jump on.
Thank you for this. I enjoyed the whole presentation, but I guess that the gem that I'm gonna take away from this presentation is the definition of accessibility. I love that it has become a context-related definition rather than a personal attribute. And actually to that, I want to add that I'm also happy that you didn't use that kind of disabled versus not disabled or normal people dichotomy in your presentation. But I have I don't remember from which book or blog or something I got this dichotomy, but currently whenever I think about accessibility and disabilities, I categorize people into disabled people and not yet disabled people, or not currently disabled people. So that sort of brings out the fact that even though I don't have a disability right now, or maybe I don't have it anymore, it's possible that in the future I most definitely will have some kind of disability, whether it's due to an accident or genetic factors or something like a global crisis that is robbing us all from our cognitive resources and presentness. So yeah, that was my 2 cents. But thank you for the presentation. Marian, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you too for the presentation. I just wanted to add some note about reflection I was having about how to improve our workflows, because accessibility, I think, it still should be part of the requirement of building good interface and being good professionals. And right now, I'm having a lot of thought about how to improve the workflows so that people are aware that those regulations, those guidelines exist. And for instance, for me, who is a designer, I have this ongoing conversation with myself about how to deal with color contrast checking, because as we saw, the numbers, like the highest issue that we have on the most common website, the most used website is this color contrast issue. And it seems like something that is more relevant for designer to think about. But right now, I don't know of any design tool that has integrated contrast checker inside of it. And I think it's a big problem also how the accessibility is positioned in relationship with our discipline. That is kind of a side thing that if you are interested in, you get into it and then you change your perspective on stuff. But if you're not into this, you just avoid it and it goes away. Also, I think there are other issues, like I think it was the second most or the third most, like the alt text for images. I'm often wonder like whose responsibility is this to take care of that. And thanks for the comment about Photoshop. Good to know. But yeah, for the alt text, for instance, is it the responsibility of the content team? Because most of the time in our project, especially in a agency setup, we don't have content people. The content is the designer and the developer doing that together. So in the end, who is in charge of writing the alt text thingy, kind of? And yeah, this is just ongoing thought of how we could better integrate accessibility requirements to our workflows.
I think like that's the ongoing topic, right? Or the big issue is that, yeah, like where does this fit in the workflow in a way? Where does, yeah, it's a lot. I don't have definitive answers. That's the thing. Like I appreciate that other people are also wondering about this. For the alt text, a funny one is there is another set of guidelines also by the World Wide Web Consortium called the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, which deals with if you're making a content management system, so like WordPress, for example, or Contentful or whatever it is, there are actually guidelines that talk about how you can encourage people to create, or not even encourage, but like either automatically create accessible content, or when that is not possible, have it be prominent that people should do something about it. So like alt text, for example, is something that would be alt text in the context of, let's say, a news organization would be covered by the authoring tool accessibility guidelines. So if you all haven't read those, like they're quite interesting in a way, because they cover exactly this thing that says, hey, what if you have these features, you promote them, and if you do things automatically, it should be automatically accessible, and if you do things manually, you should encourage editors, etc. Not encourage, support. They have very specific verbiage about that. But yeah, and sometimes it's just, it is developers and designers putting the logo on the page, and that needs to have the alt text or not, basically.
A stupid question about logos. Do logos need to have alt text? I like the Futurice logo on the new site on the top.
Yeah. So mostly yes. So it would depend on the context as well. So if that is just the logo, it's not a link. So it's not a link with the logo inside of it. If it's just the logo, I would probably just say Futurice, like the text equivalent. Now, if that happened to be a link, so a link and inside you have the logo, you might call that Futurize. And I would say that most people, well, famous last words, I would imagine, given how common it is, that people would know that it takes you to the homepage. If you really wanted to be descriptive about the purpose of it, you would give an alt text of home, probably, or homepage, such that the link itself will then have the name homepage, because the link does not have any other content, presumably, near it. Yeah.
Great answer. I just want to comment on the so great presentation, and I agree on what you said about the building the intuition into. I don't know how to pronounce it, but intuition, whatever. And that I've noticed myself as well, that when the more I think about accessibility, the easier it becomes to think about it already when you're building something and writing some HTML or React or whatever.
Also, something I didn't touch upon as explicitly, but I am reminded of right now, is that the more people you have that even a little bit can speak about accessibility, it makes it much easier for anyone to speak up about it. Like if I'm in a team of 8 people and nobody's talking about accessibility, you bet I'll feel awkward bringing up the fact that probably our site is not accessible. Now, if I have like even a couple of teammates who are interested in it, I immediately feel much more comfortable bringing it up in a way. And that also goes along. I think a lot of it is just a long tail of effort that we have to put in. Like, that's why I don't have definitive answers in a way. It's that I think it's material and it's persistent.
Really enjoyed your presentation, and I was thinking about the slide where you had like these like millions of websites that were viewed in the 6 categories, and I know one thing I've been thinking a lot about in terms of accessibility is not just like maybe the frequency, because I think sometimes if you jump in, it can be a bit overwhelming, the things to fix. But one way it was brought up to me is like, maybe there's some things that are completely preventing entire groups of people or subsets of groups of people from like using your site or service completely. And so I was curious what you thought about that. Like, how do you know where to focus? Like, for example, like maybe the alt tags, like it's good to have like 100% compliance at some point, but like, maybe if you're trying to fix things quickly and some people are not being served, like maybe like how do you identify what are those things that are like preventing people from using the service completely?
Yeah, so I've been doing actually a couple of accessibility audits these days, which is great. Love it when I get paid to do the thing I like doing. Well, the answer is much too complex, but in the sort of way I can tell you is that start with the navigation. Like make sure that people can visit the pages first of all, because like you would be surprised how many sites don't even use links to link pages. They use, I don't know, divs with on-click listeners that push to the history. So a link, just an over-engineered link. Sorry, see, I told myself I will not be salty today. Anyway, but yeah, so that would be a good thing. Like start with the navigation, make sure that the links are there. Basically, that's a very good thing. I would also imagine that landmarks is also very important, not even the headings, but literally header, main, footer aside, the HTML5 landmark elements. Those are also important because, for example, in a screen reader, you can jump to them directly, so you can navigate by them. So a lot of people, immediately, the experience is much more equivalent. Well, and then again, long tail of priorities, but I would say, yeah, make sure like people can go to the pages, the headings make sense. There are headings, first of all, that's also something that doesn't happen sometimes. Headings, landmarks, and take it from there. Yes. And oh yeah, that also reminds me, of course, that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they have 3 levels, right? A, AA, and AAA. So you could also prioritize by that. They tend to be quite specific because they're meant to be objectively verifiable to the best extent possible. But yeah, you could look into that as well. Of course, in the WCAG, the alt tags are at level A. So that does not necessarily help you much with prioritizing. So yeah, in my experience, at least, it tends to be navigation, landmarks, and headings that you can start with. Oh, and form labels, of course. Like if you have a form, like a form is just like, you know, a red light for me. It's like, okay, stop and look at this thing. Yeah, forms would also be important because, I don't know, websites would be very boring or unusable, or they wouldn't do anything without forms, right? So it stands to reason that we look into the accessibility of forms pretty high up on the list.
One question about like, if you would would, for example, have some spare time and spend some spice hours on something, and you want to have a big impact on accessibility, what would you think? Like, is there some open source libraries such as React that you could have a big impact on if you would improve some accessibility in those, or jQuery? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Definitely, I think. Well, maybe is my answer. You know what I would love to see if people had spare time? Worked examples with popular frameworks, like a worked example of how to have an accessible. And there are many out there. I can send you links. Like there are people who put in a lot of time into these things. I tend to find these more useful. Like when yeah, of course it would be great if you would work on the like API surface of React and to encourage accessibility. You would need a lot of time and energy to do that, is the thing. And I think that yeah, worked examples that can tell you, hey, here's what you can consider on this page. Here's what ways to solve things. Here's why these issues are important. That's also something that's missing quite often, like an explanation as to why are you suggesting the solution you're suggesting. That's definitely biased by my own preference. That when people ask me questions, I like it's 5 sentences and like 20 links that I send them because I know that somebody has spent the time to make those resources available.
If there's any more questions, feel free to continue in Slack. I'm sure Fotis will be happy to answer. Thank you, Fotis, for the presentation.